All right, it's 2 now. Let's get started. So welcome everyone to Ask Seminar series. This is John, the seminar coordinator. I will be moderating the seminar for you with Kathy Medley, who is our community manager. And also join us is our director, Peter, and he will be introducing the speaker before she gets started. Just so you know that this seminar is being recorded and we will post the recording on our YouTube channel. And also after the presentation, we'll enter the Q&A session. So please feel free to bring up any questions you may have. And we encourage you to unmute yourself and speak out. If you don't have a mic, you can also chat us your questions. So let me hand over the ball to Peter, our director. So Peter, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, John, and welcome all to today's ESSEC seminar, and especially welcome to today's speaker, Naomi Tague, who's a professor at UC Santa Barbara, where she works on ecohydrological modeling. And this is a topic that is of great interest to many of us, not just for the sake of this modeling in and of itself, but as we were just chatting about before we started, it's very important for people such as myself who are trying to understand the carbon cycle, the short-term carbon cycle, what goes into the what goes from the atmosphere into the ecosystem, and what goes back, and where and why. There is, as we were also mentioning, there's a lot of creative accounting going on this topic. So today we'll be hearing from somebody who actually tries to understand what is going on rather than simply fibbing about it. So we've heard, or I have heard often, sort of off-the-cuff statements like water follows carbon and carbon follows water. So I read this abstract with great interest because there is something about the link between carbon and water here. So I very much look forward to what you have to tell us, Naomi. And with that brief introduction, over to you. The floor is yours.
Great. Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me to speak in this seminar. It looks like a really interesting series. I'm going to start following it, so this is great. And as mentioned, I'm Naomi. I publish under a different name, under Christina, but last name is Tague, so you can find me. And I very much am someone who works in informatics or eco-informatics, which means many things, but a lot of what I do has been the development of, has been Earth system modeling, both the development and the application of Earth system models. And I, in fact, have been chief architect and chief developer of a particular model called RESIS, which has been around for a couple of decades now. And it is a community model. Many people are involved in the development of this, but I've really been the person shepherding it, deciding what's in and what's out. For those of you familiar with GitHub, I kind of control the GitHub repo of RESIS, right? Which is one of these models, like the models that you might see in a global climate model, but also a watershed model that brings together water, carbon, energy, and disturbance. And, today I'm going to talk about a bunch of different things, but really all of them have to do with how we use these models to think about ecohydrology. And when I say ecohydrology, I really mean this two-way interaction, right? How does vegetation impact water resources, groundwater recharge, stream flow? But conversely, how does water availability impact vegetation, right? Its productivity, its carbon cycling, its resilience to drought. And how does climate influence these interactions? And also land management, whether that's intentional, like fuel treatments, or unintentional changes to vegetation. So when you're talking about ecohydrology, I think it's really clear that these are tightly coupled systems, right? Sometimes it's really hard to tease out causality, right? How much water plants are using impacts water availability. Water availability impacts how much plant life you have in a particular location. Disturbance is coupled, right? Fire happens more when things are dry, right? But then fire changes vegetation and how much water vegetation is using. So you really have to look at these at ecohydrology, certainly terrestrial ecohydrology is this coupled system. So how do we understand coupled systems, right? And I've always said that there's not one answer to that. Really, it really is a combination. And for me, the combination is taking what we learn in the lab from intensive field experiments, where we really go in there to try to understand a particular process, right? How temperature changes plant respiration. But how do we generalize that field experiment? How do we look at how that's coupled to these other processes? Well, process-based models allow you to do that. Now, we're in this era of big remote sensing, machine learning, lots of big data sets, right? And process-based models, I would argue, sit in the middle, right? Because they help us understand why we see the patterns that we find in these large observational data sets, right? So they're the link between understanding the mechanisms in field experiments and finding big patterns with large data sets, right? So they're the place that we ask why and what if. I think it's kind of interesting to really quickly look at how much ecohydrology has changed. Early process-based modeling happened in the 60s. This isn't something new. The Stanford watershed model, which some of you might know more familiarly as SWIM, was developed in the 60s. But vegetation in that model was essentially green slime. It was some static layer, often represented by leaf area index, a single parameter that didn't change, right? If you look at process-based models now, right? And there's a bunch of really nice review papers out there. This is a figure taken from one of them. And vegetation is no longer static, right? We fully represent the carbon cycle. We take photosynthesis. We allocate it to the growth of leaves and stems and roots. We look at turnovers. We link that with a nutrient cycle so we can look at how nutrients and the cycling of nutrients affect the growth. And all of this is fully coupled with the water and energy cycle. So we've become really sophisticated in terms of the processes that we include in these coupled models. And that sophistication allows us to account for things like how climate might affect the structure of a forest over time, and therefore how much water it uses, right? We can use it to understand the role of species change and how species change might affect linkages between water and carbon. And more recently, even within our own model RHESIS, we've linked this with disturbances like fire, right? So fully coupled it with models of fire severity and fire spread. So, you know, when I say that, you might think, well, great, we have these awesome models, we're done, we can just use them. But I think, you know, that's a mistake, right? And that's kind of really what I want to spend most of today talking about, because we're still doing field work. We have new instruments, we have new ways of measuring things, and we're learning more about plants and how they function, right? We're learning more about subsurface hydrology and how it works, right? So for me, a really interesting question is, how do you bring that new learning into these models, right? These models that get used in many different contexts, right? Whether it's in a global climate model or whether it's as part of a watershed model. And I think part of the challenge there is that these models are so complex that they become black boxes. So we don't really know what's in them. And I think that's the thing I want to spend some time talking about today. So I'm going to do that by really focusing on how these Earth system models like RHESIS estimate tree water use or estimate evapotranspiration. If any of you are modelers, right, you're probably familiar with the Penman-Monteith equation. And many modelers will tell you, oh yeah, I use the Penman-Monteith equation to estimate ET. And that physically makes sense. It's an equation that incorporates radiation. It incorporates atmospheric humidity. It even incorporates stomatal conductance, right? So you know something about how plants are regulating the loss of water. But that kind of hides the complexity of what's going on, right? Because that Penman-Monteith equation is embedded in a whole bunch of things that the model has to account for, right? You have to ask, well, how is that radiation represented? Are we accounting for differences in slope and aspect, right? How are we looking at the other drivers of demand, right? How many leaves you have, how tall the tree is, right? Are we looking at how are you representing that stomatal response to water availability, right? On the supply side, right? How are you accounting for how much water actually gets into the soil, right? How are you accounting for how much water gets stored by the litter, right? How are you accounting for snowmelt and the linkages between the vegetation and the snowmelt? And how are you accounting for storage? And that's the thing I really want to focus on, right? Because storage is going to mediate the amount of supply that you have. So when I say storage, I mean, how much water does the plant see? And part of that is managed by these models because they're modeling the recharge of this store, right? And they're modeling the drainage of that store and they're modeling loss. But a really important question is how big is that store, right? What's the storage capacity? How big is the bucket? And how big the bucket is depends on both geologic characteristics, right? You can think about the field capacity and the porosity of the median in which the plant sits. There's ecological controls on that. Largely, what is the depth and distribution of roots? Where are the roots? And then if you think about the fact that many plants actually access groundwater, they're also accessing water from a store that's not necessarily local, right? So you have to think about the root drainage area, right? What's the drainage area that's actually feeding that root? Both, say, on a hill slope scale, where you're thinking about upslope contributions to a riparian zone, but also locally. Does the tree in this picture, can it see water that that neighboring tree would access, right? How lateral is its root spread? So all of these things, right, these ecological questions, these geological questions, and these questions about root drainage area, right? Models have to make all kinds of assumptions about that, right? They have to make, for the ecology, sometimes we do that by carbon cycling, right? We figure out how much carbon trees allocate to their roots. But there's a lot of species-specific parameters in that, right? Geologically, well, we say something about, we find some big soil map, a Surgo map that says something about soil texture and soil depth. But are those good enough? I think that's a really important question. So let's look at some recent papers that have been published from field observations. So this is a paper by Jesse Ham for looking at a forest in Northern California. And you can see in this picture, right? On the left side, there's a really productive forest. On the right side, it's much less productive, right? The question is why? If you go into this site, you'll see there's no difference in climate, there's no difference in topography, there's no difference in disturbance. The only reason is the subsurface geology, right? There's another recent paper that I think is a really nice one that looks at another 3 forested locations in the California Sierras. And they're all at about the same elevation, and they all get about the same amount of precipitation. They all experience kind of the same relative humidity, which you can see from the aridity index in the top right-hand corner there. But if you look at their measured evapotranspiration from flux towers, they're very different, right? So what's different? The climate's the same. What's different is the underlying geology, right? The chemistry and the sort of physical structure of the underlying soil. And what that leads to is dramatically different vegetation with dramatically different evapotranspiration. And then interestingly, what you can see in the bottom row there is that when there was a large significant drought in California, we also see substantial differences in forest mortality, right? Maybe a little bit counter to what you'd expect, the the location with deeper soils with more storage capacity that was supporting more vegetation actually experienced more mortality. But that actually makes sense if you think about it, because they had a big bucket, but finally you had a large enough drought that that bucket ran out, right? So suddenly you see this change in behavior, right? And it's interesting because, you know, you might think that we know a lot about what this geologic control of subsurface storage is, but it really is an active area of research, right? Geophysics is giving us new windows into what the subsurface looks like. This figure here shows some geophysical estimation of porosity across a hill slope. And counter to kind of established theory, you don't have more storage capacity near the riparian zones. In fact, you have more storage capacity up near the slope. And many of the soil maps, many of the parameters that we commonly use in hydrologic models don't account for this, right? So it's clear that we can point to these recent field papers that say something about local variation in what I would call plant accessible water storage capacity, right? But do we really care? Okay, there's a few examples where you have these big contrasting geologies and they make a big difference. How do we know when variation in storage capacity matters? Because if you look at a large scale map of the Sierras here, right, it's pretty clear that in low elevations where water demand is high and water availability is high, you have less vegetation. At higher elevations where you have things are wetter, you have generally more vegetation and higher ET rates. So it's kind of good to know, well, how important is this uncertainty in the size of the bucket, right? So you can run a simple hydrologic bucket model to answer that, right? We can get daily time-step climate inputs, right? And we can run a model to look at what the sensitivity here of mean annual ET is to plant available water storage capacity. So on the x-axis, I don't really have a pointer here, I can't point to it, goes across, we ran it across the full range that you might experience, up to 3 meters, right? 3 meters of water storage capacity would be like at least 6 meters of rooting depth, right? And so what you can see is that these curves are highly nonlinear, right? So how important spatial heterogeneity in storage capacity is kind of depends on where you are. There's a certain point, if you have enough storage capacity, it doesn't really matter anymore. But it's really at that half-meter storage capacity that we see these really steep slopes. I think what's also important to know is that these curves, if you derive them for different climates, right? Climates that are dominated by winter precipitation and summer drought, or climates that are dominated by summer precipitation, the shape of these curves looks different. So what that tells you is that how spatial heterogeneity or uncertainty in plant available water storage capacity, how that affects ET depends on your climate, right? Which is concerning because that means if the climate changes, your sensitivity to what we don't know about the subsurface will change. So even if you calibrated your model previously, it may not work in the future, right? And it also tells us something about how changes in things like plant roots might affect evapotranspiration and how those changes will look different depending on the climate that you're in. So we can go a little bit further with this type of exploration of why, when, and where does storage matter by using our coupled model, in this case, RHESIS, as really a virtual laboratory. So I want to take you through a couple of examples of doing that, right? And of course, we only do this because we've spent decades trying to make sure that we get some of the processes reasonably right? We compare the model against tree ring growth. We compare the model against literature estimates of leaf, carbon, and root stores when we have them. We compare it against stream flow gauges, right? So let me show you an example of how we really use this model as a virtual laboratory for a study site in the California Sierras, right? Very pretty, snow-dominated conifer site. It gets most of its precipitation during the winter. And what we did here was we simply ran the model to say, what if we had a given year and it was 2 degrees warmer? And mostly what that 2 degrees, or 3 degrees, sorry, in this case, is going to do is it's going to take the snow shown in the upper left there, and it's going to mean that most of that precipitation is now going to come in as rain, and any that does come in as snow is going to melt much earlier, right? You're also going to have slightly drier air, so your water demand is going to go up in the summer. And then the two following graphs, one shows the evapotranspiration for a given year. If we assume that we have fairly shallow roots, right? We assume we don't have very much storage capacity. And the black line shows the baseline, and the red line shows what happens when you warm up. And what happens when you warm up is that snow melts earlier, it runs off, and so there's no water available in the summer. So your ET goes down with warming. But if you have a lot of storage capacity, then all of that rain gets stored, it's available in the summer, and the increasing aridity actually increases ET, right? So whether your ET goes up or down depends on what you assume about that subsurface. We can kind of scale this up and do the same thing for transects all across the Sierras, right? That go from kind of low elevation rain dominated to high elevation snow dominated, right? And here again, the graph on the x-axis is what we assume about storage capacity going from low to high. And then on the y-axis, I'm showing you change in water use, right? So if it's above that black line, it's going up. If it's below, it's going down. And so you can see even across the whole Sierras, across that big range from water, from precipitation to snow dominate, rain dominated to snow dominated, whether you increase or decrease evapotranspiration with warming depends on what we assume about your storage, right? It's also somewhat interesting to notice that the more purple dots are dots that were originally more snow dominated, and the snow dominated sites are actually more sensitive to the storage capacity. Okay, so thus far, I've really been talking about kind of some of the virtual experiments that we've done and some of the field data that has really looked at how geology varies subsurface storage capacity and what that might mean for evapotranspiration. But of course, the other component of this are roots themselves, right? And we're estimating rooting depth by using a carbon cycling model. And there are multiple theories on carbon allocation, right? There's a lot of uncertainty about interactions between trees, right? To what extent do lateral roots overlap, right? And then there's also species differences in roots. So here again, we can use the model to start to say, well, what are some of the implications of what we're learning about the dynamics of roots from ecophysiologists and field experiments? And one of the places that really matters is when you're using these models to say something about what happens to water use when you thin a forest, or when there's a prescribed burn, or when there's forest mortality. And to what extent you'd think that if you get rid of plants, you should decrease ET. But kind of the field experiments that we have, right, that have looked at water yield changes after mortality or after thinning experiments, when you're in semi-arid Mediterranean environments, like much of California, like much of Colorado, many places in the world, what we find is we don't see increased water yield. Mostly what we see is increased water use by the remaining trees, right? Or at least we think that that's what happens. It could also be, of course, increasing evaporation from understory that's exposed when you remove adjacent trees, right? So this is where we can use a model to try to say, well, can we explain some of those field experiments that are showing, hey, we're not seeing increases in water yield? Does it make sense to say that that's actually related to water use by the remaining trees? To do that in these types of coupled models, I have to make the point that you have to be able to resolve in the model the difference between neighboring canopies and open space. A lot of models still kind of represent forests as kind of a lumped green slime. So what we did is we actually separated out within spatial patches in the watershed. Water was still allowed to move down slope, but within each of those patches, we allowed there to be different clumps of vegetation. And we allowed there to be water exchange between those clumps based on different parameters that really weren't related to topography, like you normally would when you're sort of modeling hill slope hydrology and you're just moving water down slope. Here we're putting on top of that the movement of water between patches based on wetness gradients and rooting depth. Once we set that up, we can do experiments to say, well, what happens when you thin, right? How important is this lateral root sharing of water? And we can do this by, say, doing a thinning experiment where we thin in any year of a 50-year climate record and allow the forest to recover. So here we're allowing that rooting depth to recover over time. We can compare results when you have relatively shallow soils and when you have deep soils. And we can compare it with the amount of thinning you take out. And we can look at the extent to which neighboring trees share water, right? So here's really using a model as a virtual laboratory. And when we do that, right, for our little Sage-Hen watershed, what we find is that the graph on the left here shows change in evapotranspiration after thinning during the recovery period of thinning. So remember, your forest is regrowing after you've thinned. So eventually your ET recovers. And in many cases, you'll see, especially if the soils were shallow, you actually kind of create a bump in water use, partly because you get, you've sort of you allowed the remaining trees to get bigger by releasing some of that water. The box plots show the effect of interannual climate variability. And in general, that's smaller than the difference between the blue and orange boxes, which is the difference between what happens if we assume the roots are sharing water or they're not. So what you see is, particularly for the moderate depth soils in the middle there, we see a big difference between how evapotranspiration changes following thinning, depending what we assume about lateral root sharing. And in fact, if we assume the roots fully share water, we can explain some of the observations that we see about increasing forest productivity. Now, that sharing happens laterally between, that sharing, that root networks, right? And the extent to which root networks are shared also matters when you think about mixed forests, right? The problem with mixed forests and different species is we have so little data. But we worked with some colleagues in Israel who had done some really intensive field experiments where they were able to get the rooting depths for 5 different species that were growing in a mixed forest. And what we were then able to do was use that information about the relative rooting depths to do an experiment where we ran a model to look at what we would predict in terms of forest biomass if we assumed a homogeneous stand of each of the different species, or if we ran them as a mixed species. And what we were able to show is that when we ran them as a mixed species, the fact that you have different rooting depths and you allow for different water niches, if you will, from those different trees, you actually become more efficient. We see a 20% increase in transpiration when we run it as a mixed forest and a 40% increase in biomass, right? So that sharing between different species with different rooting characteristics is actually one of the ways that we have greater productivity and greater drought resilience in a mixed forest. Now, finally, that sharing also happens at a hill slope scale, right? It doesn't just happen, on a plot when you have a mixed forest or when you're thinning, but it also happens when you're thinking about what upslope trees and riparian trees. In water-limited environments, that's often the reason riparian trees are bigger. But harkening back to that field study I showed you where the larger trees were more vulnerable to drought, you kind of want to wonder, is at some point the riparian trees, because they're bigger, are they going to be more vulnerable to drought? So again, we can look at these kind of hill slope responses. In this case, we had sap flow data that we used to help constrain some of the parameters that control how connected the upslope and riparian trees are. And we have that, plus we have stream flow data. So we use that to help us at least put some bounds on the subsurface connections between upslope and riparian trees in this forest. And then we're able to do drought experiments, right? And we're able to look at how ET changes in a 4-year consecutive drought. We compare the results if there's no drought, if the drought is related to a lack of rain, or if the drought is related to not a lack of precipitation, but that precipitation melting earlier. So we could think of that as a snow drought, or the worst case scenario where things are warm and there's no precipitation. And so you can see that the ET decreases kind of in all scenarios, but the red boxes, which are the upland, decrease much more quickly than the riparian. But you can see there's a fair amount of uncertainty there in those boxes, right? And much of that uncertainty, if you look at the graph on the right, the dotty plots on the right, they show how that difference between upslope and riparian is contingent on different drainage parameters that control the storage and connectivity, the storage of water in the upslope and riparian, and how connected those stores are. So again, I think what we're seeing here, kind of I'm throwing all these different examples out here, right? But what I'm really trying to show you is that there's a lot of evidence that spatial heterogeneity in this bucket, in the size of the bucket, the plant available storage water capacity, right? There's significant spatial heterogeneity in that, right? And how sensitive your plant water use is to that depends on climate, right? We also see that species differences, lateral root sharing, things that we don't know about roots can have a big effect on what we assume about what happens when you have a disturbance or when you have a drought, right? And all these things are important because much of this uncertainty is ignored in many watershed models, right? Now, if you're a machine learning person, you might say, well, we can use measured ET to calibrate, based on what you've told me, what that storage capacity should be. But that's not so easy because ET itself is actually very hard to measure. Don't be fooled by the fact that there's lots of products out there, things like Modus ET, EcoStress, OpenET. If you're looking at global scale big patterns, they're great, right? But they themselves are models, right? And if you compare them with flux towers, their R-squareds can range from 0.3 to 0.8. They're not perfect models, right? In part, it's also worth noting that many of these products rely on greenness because that's really what the satellites see. And greenness can change for lots of reasons. Greenness doesn't always show you what the stomats are doing, right? And then the final issue with this is in order to derive capacity, sometimes you need to have measurements when the storage is limited. And that may only happen in a drought. So that assumes you have these measurements during a drought, right? The other problem with trying to get at this from calibration is that if you have measured ET and you're trying to infer storage, you have to know something about the inputs. And there's a fair bit of uncertainty, particularly at fine spatial scales still, about what precipitation patterns actually are. Now, I've pointed to a few frontiers, but there are other things, other new findings from field scientists that are really interesting. So for example, recent studies have shown that mycorrhizal, right, the microbial community are really important in extending roots. And that we kind of already knew. And many models kind of just lump mycorrhizal roots in with rooting depths, right? But in this study, for example, they showed that when they took the microbial community from one stand and put it in another, it affected the tree resilience to drought. Effectively, if you took microbes from a location that was already arid and put it in a place where you were going to experimentally cause a drought, those trees were more resilient, which means those microbes were better able to get water, right? So this kind of microbial facilitation of adapting tree roots to drought is something that none of our models currently account for. Similarly, there's been some recent paper by geologists, right, who have looked at, well, how quickly, we all know that plants create over time, over hundreds and thousands of years, they affect soil erosion, right? Plants are really good at that. But recent studies have shown that that happens faster than you might think. On the order of years and decades, plants can actually change things like field capacity and porosity, right? So does all of this kind of ecophysiologic and geophysical complexity matter? And I think you could probably convince me that if you're talking about big global scale patterns, it probably doesn't, right? Or maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, right? But I think I've shown you many examples where if you're using watershed or Earth system models to ask questions about how is my watershed going to respond to climate change? Or what happens when I do a thinning experiment, right? Or what happens if species change? Then it really does. And if we're going to be using these types of models as virtual labs and digital twins of these watersheds, I think we have to be more aware of some of the advances that are happening in the realms of ecophysiology, in the realm of geophysics research. So really what I'm kind of trying to illustrate here is something that people keep saying, right? Everyone says we have to have more dialogue between model developers and field scientists, right? But it's hard, right? It takes a lot of investment. It takes a lot of time. And I don't think we still don't facilitate that interaction as well as we might. The other thing, I think it's important, what I've learned and something I'm trying to communicate in this talk is that models are best for hypothesis generation, which means you use them as virtual labs, right? You have to be able to move away from, I know what the rooting depth is, and say, well, I don't know what the rooting depth is, but how important is that uncertainty? That's using a model as a virtual laboratory. And in many ways, I think that that's what they're good for. So we need to be better at using models in this kind of sensitivity analysis virtual laboratory way, which means setting it up to make it easy to do that. Which leads me to my final point. Models will be great at this if you know what's in them. If you don't know what's in them, it's really hard. And, any of you that have done any work with an Earth system model know, oh, how does the model represent litter water storage capacity and litter evaporation? Maybe you can find it in a paper if you're lucky. Half the time, what you have to do is actually go through the model code, which isn't something that's really going to facilitate this dialogue between the experimentalist and the modeler, right? So it's something that I've been really trying to work towards, although it's hard, is trying to say there's a lot of knowledge embedded in Earth system models. It's really valuable, right? It's kind of one of the ways that we put what we've learned from field experiments together. But if we can't expose that, it's not as useful as it could be. So I've been really trying to think about what are ways that we can better do that? Can we develop interfaces, information systems that better allow us to do that, right? So work in progress for me is something I've been working on for like the last year or so, is trying to develop a interface that called the Blue Marble, right? Which allows you to go in and say, how do we represent different processes? But not just how do we represent them? How is that linked with some current review papers on the state of the science about, for example, how we model the relationship between root carbon and root depth, right? What are the different models out there? What does the kind of current field science say? Now, of course, this is something that would have to be dynamic because new field science is happening all the time, right? But I see this as kind of a dynamic way of bringing together model representations and using that as kind of your knowledge landscape and looking at the connections between processes and then linking that with literature review. Now, you might tell me, oh, I can do this with ChatGPT, but boy, you'd have to know how to ask the right questions. And I don't think most people do. I almost think about this as a really sophisticated prompt engineering system that takes into account the knowledge that we have embedded in our models to help you do that prompt engineering. Might be one way to think about this. Okay, so that's kind of my pitch for, in my work as chief architect of RESIS and someone who's used Earth system models in many different capacities, I really see this as the frontier. I think there's a lot of really exciting new measurements, understanding out there, but we need to get better at bringing that knowledge together. And I think models are good ways to do that, but to do that, you have to know what's in the model. So I'll leave you with a couple things. A side thing that I do is I work with a local artist on a variety of different projects. And I used a picture from this recent exhibit that we collaborated on, where I talked to him a lot about trees and their water use. And he came up with these really beautiful renderings of what I see is which is actually tree water use, right? The fact that trees are using water from different sources, those different sources are going up different parts of the stem. And I just, there's some science that motivated this piece of art. And you could think of it as science communication, but I mostly like to think about it as something that reminds me of, as a scientist, about just how complex this can be. My little RESIS model version of tree water use is not nearly as complex and beautiful as this picture, but the picture reminds me that we should continue to move towards that to the extent that data is available to help us do that. So that's my 40 minutes. That's my pitch. Of course, this is work done by many, many people, and I thank all of them, especially my students. And I'll take any questions.
Thank you so much. Okay, so if you have any questions for the speaker, you can raise your hand and you should all be able to unmute yourself. And if you do not have a microphone, you can type your question in the chat, or you can just tell me in the chat you have a question and I'll cue you.
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead, Tempest.
Hi, great talk. I'm curious if you think that, I guess I have two questions, both of which are hard, and I'm sorry. But the first is, you've convinced me that maybe we should be worried about incorporating the porosity of soils and storage into our Earth system models. You've convinced me that it's important. How would I go about doing that, or deciding if it's important to my system to go about representing these root and soil-based processes? That's my first question. And then my second question is, hey, it seemed like you found that the model sort of expected these differences in evapotranspiration based on how much storage was in that system. That seems like something you could manipulate experimentally. And are you considering doing that, either to confirm your findings or just I don't know, as a management intervention for people who might want to change the drought resilience of trees?
Right. Those are both really great questions. So let me tackle the first one. So as I said, there's two parts to getting that storage capacity right. There's the geo part and there's the eco part, right? And I think geologists right now, because suddenly we have ground penetrating radar, we have new ways to see the subsurface, right? And I think now the problem with using that data at this point is they haven't completely figured out how to translate that image you get into actual things like porosity and field capacity and water storage, but they're close, right? So I think part of the way is working with geologists who are actually starting to generate those data sets. I also think geologists are starting to think about, like, now that they have more data, they're advancing their theories about where you would expect, for example, soils to be like deep and where we'd expect them to be shallow, right? So I think part of that is, making friends with your local geologists and asking them. Kind of the same thing with the roots, right? I'm working with some ecophysiologists that I'm not sure this will give us the answer, but is actually growing roots in saturated air and then like stressing the plants to see what they do. There's a lot of work being done in these areas. So I think part of it is going out and talking to the ecophysiologists and saying, well, what do you think the roots are going to, what are the important differences between species, right? What is a good model of carbon allocation, right? But the other point I would make, those figures that I showed you, I really like your point about like, oh, well, why don't we run these experiments, right? So one of the cool things about doing some of these simple models is what this curve looks like, right? So what this curve is telling you is if, it's going to tell you the storage capacities where you would expect to see a big response, right? So at least that the shape of this curve looks different for different climates, right? So the first thing you should do is make this curve, which is actually pretty easy to make. And then for your particular location where you're interested in this, right? And then you can sort of see the range of storage capacities where you're going to expect high sensitivity. So that's where you're going to do your experiment, right? However it is you're going to do it. And, there's lots of ways to do that, right? Some of it's, it depends on how you want to do that, right? Like it might be changing your tree species, right? It might be trying to find from a geology map where you would find one storage capacity versus the other, right? So a lot of that's a creativity in defining what those experiments look like. Does that answer your question? I think.
Sure, thanks.
I see your hand up. I got a quick private question. How is remote sensing data used for your modeling work?
Yeah, great question. Really, obviously a big question because there's so many different types of remote sensing data. It depends on how we're using the model, right? Sometimes we use it to, like, if we're in a lot of the fire modeling we've been doing, for example, we use remote sensing of vegetation structure to set initial conditions, right? We've used LiDAR remote sensing to do a better job of parameterizing different forest structures, right? The, forest density, what happens when you thin, right? When the Forest Service, for example, goes out and thin, what do they actually change and how do you know? Remote sensing data is really great for giving that to you. We have done some work, using one of the big sources of uncertainty in modeling that I didn't talk about is what is the precip input, particularly in mountain environments, right? And so we've done some work lately with looking at new snow products that tell you a little bit more about the spatial patterns of snow as inputs to the model. So there isn't one way that we use remote sensing data. Sometimes we compare the model estimates with remote sensing data, right? But in a way, then you're comparing a model with a model, but still it tells you something. It's often very interesting if they differ. So we use remote sensing data really in a case-by-case basis, depending on what the question is that we're asking.
Thank you. So Daniel, I think you can ask your question now.
Hi, can you hear me? Thank you. My name is Daniel. I think my question is just to know your thoughts because you mentioned some things about the machine learning part of our processes and trying to incorporate it in modeling and all. My question is around like, what's your thought process about testing hypotheses of different variables in isolation? So I understand that the variables of an ecosystem is kind of all connected, and that's what you've been doing in these earth models. But what about cases where you want to test a particular variable in isolation of others. So for example, you want to say, how does drought or agricultural drought impact crop productivity or forest vegetation? And you just isolate remote sensing, you isolate soil moisture as a variable in that case. Probably you take the surface soil moisture or the root zone soil moisture. You with your experience in this field right now, what do you think about the isolation of just a single variable to check its impact on another variable? And do you think, I don't want to make it a two-part question. I think I will just stick to that. So thank you.
There's a lot to say about that question, right? It's a really interesting question. So one thing I would say about one thing coupled models are good for is figuring out what variable you should isolate. Because whether it makes sense to isolate one variable depends a lot on what that variable is, right? So, let's say your variable is precipitation, right? Well, is it total annual precipitation? Is it, we just worked on a study where we were looking at precipitation is the same, right? But comes in larger, less frequent storms. Does that make a difference, right? So you have to be, I think what's cool about models like this is at least it lets you generate hypotheses about what might be the interesting variable to look at. Is it precipitation? Is it, the time between storms of the precipitation? You mentioned soil moisture. I always find soil moisture really tricky because soil moisture is really soil moisture is like, if you have a lot of soil moisture at any given point in time, what does that mean for plant water use, right? Like, it could be that your plants just aren't doing very well, so they're not using the water. Soil moisture is tricky, right? Because soil moisture, in effect, both drives plant water use and also responds to plant water use, right? So I find it kind of a difficult variable. In ways, I find variables that are a little bit more clearly responses, even biomass or as an output or precipitation as an input, to be a little bit easier. So I think you can, we like to know about single variables. That's why I did those experiments with just changing temperature, right? Because you like to know how a very specific variable influences a system, right? But I think it's good to explore different ways of characterizing that variable and use models to play with that. And then that helps you design the field measurements that you would want to make if you were actually going to go out and try to develop some sort of relationship between a variable and a response.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else have any questions before we wrap up? Probably have time for one or two. Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming and to our latest seminar. And thank you so much to Naomi for giving us this great talk. As always, we will have the seminar video up on our YouTube channel end of this week, perhaps early next week. I think I'm a little behind, so apologies on that. And John, correct me if I'm wrong. I always forgot to check this into the last minute. I believe we do not have a seminar next week. Let me just quickly confirm that. Everybody just hold tight for a second. Yes, we do not have a seminar next week. So I will see you all in 2 weeks. Thank you so much, everybody. See you later.
Thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you.